from Heterodox Academy. This is Half Hour of Heterodoxy. Conversations with scholars and authors. Ideas from diverse viewpoints and perspectives. Here's your host, Chris Martin.
In 2016, Jonathan Haidt gave a talk at a number of American universities in which he made the provocative argument that universities must choose either truth or social justice as their primary motive for operating. He argued that universities used to be centered around truth and that going forward some universities could continue to do that, whereas others could be frank about declaring social justice to be their primary motive. He did not argue that students couldn't pursue social justice at a university, but simply that the university itself had to choose one primary goal. Today I'm talking to Chad Wellmon, an expert on the history of universities, about whether universities truly were motivated by the pursuit of truth, or whether history is in fact more complicated. I've known Chad since 1995, when he and I were classmates at Davidson College, and in some of the same humanities courses. Chad's now an associate professor of German studies at the University of Virginia. His most recent book was Organizing Enlightenment, about the foundation of the modern research university. He's also the co-author of the upcoming book Permanent Crisis, The Humanities in a Disenchanted Age. So we're here to talk about your recent essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education, in which you respond to Jonathan Haidt's assertion that the university must have one purpose, truth or social justice. You've pointed out in several of your writings that universities have actually always been divided between several purposes. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I think my point was basically a historical one, and that's simply to say that universities have never had just one purpose. They've always pursued multiple, and some could even say, I think, competing purposes or ends, whether that's the attempt to maintain church doctrine or educate clergy, the attempt to form democratic citizens, produce economic value, to create and transmit knowledge, or quite simply just to maintain culture and class. I think various universities across time and space have pursued multiple ends. Now, that's not to say, and I think this is important, and this is where I think the claim that universities have historically pursued something like truth, there's a certain very important truth to that. But I would put it something more like this. This thing called the university, this social institution, has historically what distinguishes a university from, say, just a factory or a court, or even historically a library or a lab, is that they have been bound up with creating knowledge and educating people. And those two functions have worked together in different ways. And of course, what it means to create knowledge, to educate people, varies historically and culturally as well. My main pushback in this notion that universities have to choose between two different teloi, two different purposes, I think that really underestimates the complexity, but also the resilience and variety that universities have displayed over the past centuries.
So when the university was being run by clergy, why wasn't there a unified purpose at the time?
Take, for example, the university, 13th century Paris. It's not even really accurate to say they were run by clergy. I mean, these were corporate institutions. Think of them more along the lines of guilds. I mean, that's what these early modern universities were. They were corporations of students and scholars who were bound together for their own internal purposes. And one of those was to train future clergy. They were given license, basically in very formal ways, by the church, but also crucially by the state. So universities have historically functioned as not fully autonomous, but strangely autonomous institutions. And you can see that this weird kind of social space that they have always occupied or traditionally occupied opens them up to competing interests and competing pursuits. So when you're talking, say, again, about 13th century Paris, you have very explicit state interests, but you also have very explicit church interest, and you also have very distinct internal interest, right? So you have the students and scholars pursuing their own ends, and of course their notorious battles even internally between, say, students and scholars, such that entire universities, students will get up and try to leave in Jena in a German university earlier in the 18th century. There were tensions, and Jena tried to move after problems with local civil authorities. So even internally, these tensions, bubble up and become pretty acute sometimes, and then they're of course repeated externally as well. So again, that's just this notion that the university pursues one purpose undersells that, and I think there's a real, in terms of how this history affects today, if we don't understand the complexities internally and externally of the different groups that universities are trying to appease or the different ends that universities are pursuing, then we're missing something important.
And your book, Organizing Enlightenment, is about the foundation of the modern research university in Germany. At the time the modern research university was founded, was there at least briefly a period when there was some collective purpose?
No, it's short. I think it was ideal, right? It was very normative. So over the course, by the early modern period into the 18th century, by and large, universities were almost second-rate institutions, right? The real knowledge production, the new forms of knowledge, especially with regards to the emerging natural sciences, those are really taking place in a host of other institutions, like salons and academies, and in odd ways, even libraries. So universities up through the 18th century were kind of secondary institutions in that regard. But something very interesting began to happen, especially in German universities over the course of the 18th century, and that is this much closer relationship between universities and the state. So you have something like the University of Göttingen, founded in the 1730s, and I think you really could argue that there was a coherent purpose to a university like Göttingen, and it was a mercantilist institution. It served to make money for the state coffers. By and large, 18th century, these Enlightenment factories, as they were called, did have a coherent kind of organizing purpose, and they were closely bound up with a state. And that out of this institution kind of emerges the research university. And that book was about the emergence over the course of the late 18th, early 19th century, the university with which I think most of us are familiar with, this kind of the R1, as we call them, right, in the United States. But these institutions which are devoted to creating and transmitting knowledge, but in a very particular way. And so in the first half of the 19th century, you could argue that the research university emerges as a distinct ideal that tries to give a clear purpose and a clear focus to what universities do, but just as importantly, what distinguishes these institutions from, the rise of more complicated public spheres and other ways of creating and transmitting knowledge, especially wrapped up with newer technologies like print.
And when it comes to educating students in terms of their moral character, you've written about that as well, and how the American university, this peculiar thing happened where that duty got shifted to extracurricular organizations, which is why people from Europe and Asia, people like myself, when they come to the American university, tend to be surprised by the amount of extracurricular activity there is. How did that shift happen? How did moral character building get outsourced in that way at the American university?
Yeah, so I think the research university, the model is adopted and adapted in the United States, kind of in the final decades of the 19th century, in large part from kind of German models, but really transformed, once they came to the U.S. in the late 19th century. And but as universities like Johns Hopkins and Stanford and Chicago, these newer universities, but also established universities, especially Harvard, and then with the Morrill Act, state universities, when they began to adopt this research model, universities are about producing research, that really began to put another alternative about what higher education could be over and against what had long been the case in the American context, which was basically the classical college, right? This collegiate model, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, that had been around for centuries, in which you had a fixed curriculum, you had daily chapel, you had a college president who was also clergy of some sort. The capstone course that everybody would take and that would usually be taught by the college president was something like a moral theology course. And this capstone course kind of embodied what this classical American college was. It was a cumulative course that brought together more, questions about truth, questions about morals, and questions about religion into one coherent, seminar. And the research university model put all kinds of pressure on that.
So there was an implicit understanding at the time that if you were attending a university, you were a Christian.
Absolutely. At least for these American colleges, they were explicitly, although very broadly, Protestant, right? So it was a white male, largely East Coast, actually, kind of underlying Protestant culture. And the question of confessionalism was one that riled and the American colleges for decades, but the broad kind of background culture was absolutely this elite Protestant, vaguely Protestant culture, and that gave kind of the shared cultural foundations for things like chapel, for things like shared norms, for things like a shared moral code. And that really allowed for this set curriculum in American colleges. And that starts to dissolve and face all kinds of pressures by the end of the 19th century.
The United States, obviously, being a nation of immigrants, started to have much more religious diversity than nations like England and France and Italy.
Right. Well, that, and then you have increasingly, especially with the first half of the 20th century, the admission of women, the admission of Jews, and then slowly, very slowly, as kind of racial segregation is challenged both in the courts and by even internally by students and some faculty, you have an influx of new populations, of new groups of people who had traditionally been shut out, or as that was the case here at the University of Virginia, enslaved peoples who built the university, slowly and gradually over decades and decades and decades, finally get access to these institutions of higher education. And with all of this, right? So on the one hand, you could look at the American college, this fixed curriculum, as a bastion of coherence and moral community. But it's a very, very, it's one that's explicitly white, explicitly Protestant, and explicitly elite, and which excludes most people. And once those barriers start to come down, then you have basically a century of attempts to try to, on the part of these institutions, many of them trying to recover some sense of coherence, some sense of unity, some sense of integrity. And, these show up in debates which we're very familiar with, but perhaps from a different frame. Debates about Western civilization, debates about the canon, debates about the humanities, debates about general education. And I see all of, today, so many of the issues that Haidt, for example, discusses. For me, you can't talk about these issues on campus without talking about this very long history of attempts to figure out what might bind universities together and colleges together and give them some sense of coherence. And this comes directly back, and I'll stop right there, but maybe we can go back to it. The question, the other thing I see is the institutional shift that came to mark American universities and colleges over the course of the 20th century. And it's this massive chasm that developed between curricular and extracurricular institutions, or this curricular divide that came to characterize the American university over the course of the 20th century.
So how successful do you think extracurricular activities have been at building moral character?
well, not very. At least in any kind of coherent sense, right? If you think of, moral character as to quote kind of 19th century theories, the harmonious development of faculties or capacities, not vary. But I would say my concern, do I think they were successful? They were successful in certain ways, so take a place like, again, I'll just use UVA, University of Virginia. We have, this very long history of student run, almost autonomous student life here, in which students take very seriously. They run massive numbers of organizations. They do kind of incredible things both here on campus, but also throughout the community. But what happened over the course of the 20th century is, as the classical American college kind of was overtaken by the research university, at the beginning of the century, there was a great anxiety that among kind of university administrators in particular, that undergraduate education was just being marginalized, right? And that was always the focus of American colleges, those 4 years of undergraduate education. They were losing funds, but also attention and also thought to graduate education and professional schools, right? This is what's getting, all the attention, the concerns go. And there's kind of this no man's land for a number of decades. And then there's a kind of a renewed attention beginning kind of in the 1920s and 1930s when you have, most people think, the Harvard, Yale, Princeton college house system, goes back centuries, but it's actually from the late 20s and 1930s. And those were explicit attempts to refocus those institutions on undergraduate education, right, to give a certain coherence about it. And so you have these massive investments of funds and energies and fundraising to build back up undergraduate education and try to recover some sense of a coherent undergraduate experience. But what happens is this energy, most of it comes from administrators. Most of it comes from, well-meaning donors as well. They end up building up this entire para-institution at American colleges and universities. And it's what we call, extracurricular life, or you call it the Office of the Dean of Students, counseling centers, big time college sports. I mean, this is when the first big stadiums are getting built. This is when you have the Career Services Center. You have this entire infrastructure, which if you spend any time on an American college or university, you're very familiar with. So you have this entire secondary institution built up, and basically its mission, like what it takes as its self-understanding, is the cultivation and development of something like moral character. And then don't forget, although this is often what has happened, you still have a curriculum and a faculty kind of across campus doing what they've always done.
And this is the period where you find universities trying to defend Western civilization and Western values, where you see the invention of the humanities course at Columbia University to assimilate new immigrants.
Right. And so you could say, so this is, you have this extracurricular buildup, the secondary institution buildup, and you still have certain pockets of faculty who are still interested in undergraduate education. Right. For many faculty, I would argue, even obviously till today, that all of this whole extracurricular business comes as a giant relief, right? I mean, if you don't have to worry about your students' souls, then you're going to have more time to write.
Especially if you want NSF grants.
Yeah, no, exactly, right. I mean, if you don't have to eat with your students and constantly read with them and reflect on them, not just in classroom and lab time, but over the evenings and walk around with them on campus, you're going to have a lot more time to do research, whatever that might be. But there are pockets of faculty members who, for varying reasons, try to recover something of that coherence, that they imagine that the classical American college provided. And I would say things like, the Columbia humanities sequence, all of the general education programs, which none of them emerged until, right, they start showing up in the 1920s and 1930s, Chicago's core. Those are all efforts by faculty to, depending on, which figures we're talking about, trying to take back or recover something that they felt was lost. And in a sense, something that they felt responsible for, right? Something like a whole education of a student.
And also these were basically anti-fascist courses.
Oh, well, yeah, the first one, yeah, well, the first ones, so the Columbia course, started out as the War Aims course, right? The one you, I think, initially mentioned. This was at the final years of World War I, and it kind of spilled on after, and they were defending America's decision to get involved in the war. And these courses were all, from the beginning, they laid claim to, there is a coherent culture, there is a coherent civilization that we want to defend over against fascism, totalitarianism. Another key point and time frame in this is the late 30s and 1940s.
We could even call them the first Antifa.
Oh no! Yeah. It might be, it might be true, and but then you also have a resurgence of them in the Cold War in a lot of ways, right? So it's this external enemy and other that can help define a culture and a civilization were crucial to the emergence of the humanities as an institutional project, of general education as an institutional project. And these are always, again and again, it revolves around coherence, integrity, harmony, where moral character is a stand-in for all of that. And, humanities, lit professors might not use moral character today, but they're going to have other words for it, right? I mean, they're going to have different stand-ins for that attempt to recover.
Can you talk about what you think extracurricular life at American universities is now doing?
Yeah, it's its own institution, right? So you hear the complaints about, lazy rivers and climbing walls and buffets, but that really, I think, obscures, on the one hand, the real richness of this extracurricular life, right? The real value that all of these extracurricular programs have brought in. So for example, here at the University of Virginia, I'm what's called principal of Brown College, which is UVA's oldest residential college. My students they live in dorms for 4 years. I live on grounds with my family with them. And so I guess you could say that that's extracurricular, right? There aren't classes that I teach, but there's some amazing stuff that goes on there. We eat with them. I lead a science fiction reading group, something that I'm explicitly not an expert in, but they come to my house and we read, and it looks like a relaxed classroom. But what has happened is again, as I mentioned earlier, is this is created in general. That's kind of an exception. My role as a residential college principal is kind of an exception. Otherwise, faculty do their things, and an entire professional army, they are the ones who look over the succor and the care and the moral development of our undergraduates. And for the most part, they are amazing and incredible people who from personal experience, can attest to the fact that they are indefatigable in their work, and they have kept several students alive, just basically alive. But they do that from across campus, right? They do that with very little relationship to what happens in the seminars, the courses, and the labs and the curricula that faculty lead. So you have two separate institutions, one charged with kind of the moral care of character of our students, and the other charged with kind of the intellectual life of our students. And that is a unique development in kind of the history of universities, that these should be so bifurcated. And I think that's a real problem, that this sharp divide between an intellectual life, a life of the mind, and the life of a moral character and a moral life.
And you've written about Teresa Sullivan. She was the president of UVA during the time of the neo-Nazi march. You've written about her response and how you felt it was inadequate because there was a lack of moral clarity. She, for some reason, did not explicitly name white supremacy as the ideology that motivated this neo-Nazi march. Why do you think this is happening at the administrative level?
So my initial response to that was sharply critical, of President Sullivan and her initial reluctance to name the white supremacists who marched across grounds. And then I began to qualify that. Then I said, well, what should I expect? What should any of us expect from a university president? Because university president, she isn't, like one of those 19th century college presidents who taught a moral theology seminar to all of the fourth year students that try to bring everything together. She runs a massive corporation, right? She runs a massive international corporation, more in excess of $3 billion annual budget, an entire health system with the hospital and all of its adjunct facilities, an entertainment complex, a sustainability enterprise, an entire human resources division, a massive investment firm. And so to compare and to even expect kind of a moral coherence or a coherence of purpose from a university president today, maybe is a bit unfair, or at least is what I started to think, or at least is not. It's not being honest about what the university has long been, which is a much more complicated kind of international enterprise, at least kind of big kind of state R1 institutions like the University of Virginia.
And when it comes to students who are explicitly pursuing social justice, in your experience, do you feel like they're pursuing it in a way that creates tension with the goal of truth finding?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. At least it's in tension with the goal of truth finding, as understood according to this vision of the university that no longer exists. I mean, to be honest, in my experience, like for example, here at UVA, it's completely unsurprising that say what has been called, I think rather dismissively, kind of the social justice warriors, that they would appeal to bureaucratic processes, right? Be that DisInvitations of speakers, no platforming, because that's what they've been taught, right? They have been taught, we have taught them, faculty have taught them, that the place for questions about moral injury and desire and personal affront are to be submitted to a bureaucratic process, right? So these questions about moral injury are then transmuted into some object, say a complaint, that has to flow through a depersonalized procedure that produces an outcome and then is adjudicated, right? That's very different from addressing these questions as questions of character, duty, moral insight, evil, justice, all the kinds of things that I would hope still on occasion you can address in seminars and classrooms. And so they're very adept at understanding what the system wants, be that AP courses and applying to colleges, these especially these elite students. They're very adept at understanding what's expected of them and then providing that. And so what this bifurcation of curricular and extracurricular institutions has done, I think, has trained students, has formed students and faculty as well, and staff as well, to understand intellectual desires and moral desires as separate projects, as separate desires, right? So they know how to behave, they know how to comport themselves in a classroom, they know how to comport themselves within the bureaucracy. So do I think there are limitations to that in the actions, of the students? Absolutely. But I would just as vigorously want to say that they have been formed to do that. So in that sense, they're doing what they have been trained to do. And quite frankly, I don't think the university has really any facility at this point to address that gap and to train them and show and teach them that there are other ways to address these issues.
Quite a few people believe there was a stark change around 2012 when students became much more likely to vehemently ask for disinvitations. Do you have any idea what precipitated that?
I don't. Well, I mean, I have ideas. It's a very tough question. One, I don't know the data well enough to really comment on whether we can see proof or evidence for an increase in, say, kind of disinvitation and no platforming. I would also say, as we know, kind of with the Milo episodes, that many of these campaigns, these so-called free speech campaigns, were highly orchestrated, I think, to produce a certain outcome, and paid for to produce a certain outcome, right? So I see it more as performance art. All that said, right? So I wouldn't want to, make this simply kind of a question to try to adjudicate whether disinvitation has increased or not increased, because I would say, in my own experience here, and I think research, that Haidt summarizes well and addresses well, for example, the increase in anxiety and depression and suicide rates, not only in college students, right, but what I understand kind of extending over American adolescents has increased. But what I would say is universities are more fundamentally ill-equipped, and this just returns to what we were talking to deal with these, because all of these questions, unfortunately, are handled in a distinct one area of university life, and that's the extracurricular life, right? So if there is something like a persistent purpose among multiple and competing purposes, right? Something like, Haidt calls it truth-seeking. I might call it education and knowledge creation. If the university is going to distinguish itself and remain an institution that has an identifiable set of purposes, that distinguishes it socially, and that what it can do better, and what society, I would quite frankly say, desperately needs right now, then it can't simply turn itself into another massive counseling centers for 18 to 22-year-olds, right? It can't take on the burden wholly, right, of other public institutions as they crumble. But what it can do, at least, and historically it has the resources, although right now, as I mentioned, I'm not very sanguine about it. What it can do is say, well, what we as university can do is address this differently, right? We can address this as an intellectual and as a moral matter. And I think that's the really salient point of distinction for universities, is that these questions, which are crucial not only to the well-being of our particular students, but also to the well-being and flourishing of our society, these are questions that can't be bifurcated into kind of intellectual and moral projects, or political and simply university projects. I mean, these are common social problems and common social questions. And that's what universities have long done in various ways. They've responded to and tried to help their societies, their cultures, understand and better address the most pressing issues of the day. And if one of those is mental health, or the question of well-being, in a kind of a hyper capitalist era, then I think that is something that an extracurricular model is not going to do very well.
It is definitely a puzzle why 2012 was a turning point. We chatted about this offline, but I think you agree that positive psychology courses and happiness courses, like the one I teach at Georgia Tech, are a way to focus scholarly attention on depression and anxiety rather than outsourcing that to counseling services. And it helps students see sociological factors that might cause mental illness and prepare students to deal with difficulties in a way that other courses won't prepare them.
So I think all the courses you just mentioned are examples of, a strong desire on the part of students who, seem to enroll heavily in courses like this, to address not only, as you were saying, and I think it's very important, kind of historical, sociological questions, but also, the philosophical and religious questions about what it means to lead a good life, what it means to lead a full life. It provides consolation. It provides critical distance. It can provide all of these things to think through with students. How have different traditions, religious, philosophical, political, social, understood happiness, understood well-being, right?
Right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Thanks for joining us on the show today. It's been great having you.
Chris, thank you so much for the invitation. It was really fun.
You can learn more about Chad at his blog, chadwellmon.com. Wellmon is spelled Wellmon. He's also on Twitter at @CWellmon. I hope you enjoyed the last episode with Kevin Cruz about fault lines. His co-author Julian Zelizer will be on an upcoming episode. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes, and if you have any comments about today's episode, you can contact me at podcast@heterodoxacademy.org or tag me on Twitter at ChrisMartin76. If you're an academic, you can also learn more about joining Heterodox Academy at heterodoxacademy.org. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is produced by Heterodox Academy. Find us online at heterodoxacademy.org, on Twitter at HDX Academy, and on Facebook.